I said there were two things we failed to do. We had failed to get all three of the main parties to sit round a table and really be sincere at the same time about wanting peace. We'd hold meetings where one party would want peace and the other two wouldn't, or two would and then the other one wouldn't. But we never found a simultaneous time where their wish for peace coincided, where we could have a meaningful negotiation. And that is why you need some sort of military insurance in these things, because somebody has to keep them apart until you get to that time when you can do it. But the other thing we failed to do was to get the aid agencies to sit round the table and agree a common aim. And that is another problem in these areas. But we can discuss that through question time if you want. The other part of the arrogance is to assume that politicians in that part of the world are somehow third world politicians who don't understand the realities of power and diplomacy. I got into trouble with a particular... I always said that because I was United Nations, I wasn't working for the British government. I was working for the United Nations. That worked until I got back from Bosnia and I was called in and told, now you're back in the British Army, this is what you did wrong. Well, fine, you know. But there was this assumption that these people weren't really very good at politics and diplomacy. And the reason I got into trouble was I suggested to a British minister who'd been very pompously all day in Sarajevo telling us what was wrong. And this was close to the time when one side actually bombed its own people and blamed somebody else, which is quite common in these struggles, by the way. I'll go back to my comment about good people not always being good and bad people not always being bad. And I said to him, the thing you're forgetting, Minister, is that if you go back tonight, as you will, and make a speech which is unpopular, and the President or the Prime Minister or the Queen calls you in and raps your knuckles and the whips shout at you and the press give you a bad time, that's fine. If these guys make that sort of speech, they don't get home. Or if they do, they find their families with their throats cut. So I knew why I was there. I wasn't finding a solution, but I was stopping something. The Afghan tribes have been fighting each other since before Alexander the Great marched in, which you all know is the 4th century BC. Since that time, the Punjab, Baluchistan, Waziristan, the Afridis, who incidentally used to call themselves the Apaireti, have been fighting each other. So you won't stop that war by us pulling out. Whether we helped it by going in is a separate question. Incidentally, the Afridis, who now sit centred in the Vale of Peshawar, are Pathans. And that particular bunch believe they're descended from King Saul. They believe that when the tribes dispersed from captivity, several of them came east, and they believe they're descended from the grandson of King Saul. So if you want to be understanding how they think, don't just assume it's a load of Johnny-come-lately Muslims. There's a much deeper sense of hatred between these tribes, and you will not get a democracy out of that, just as you won't get it in Libya. But again, that's not a question. Well, anyway, let's go on. You mentioned Osama bin Laden. By the time he was taken out, I would admit he was a sinecure. He wasn't really that important. But you said that terrorism grew after the way we reacted to 9/11. I will contest that. That terrorism was growing. Whatever you believe Al-Qaeda to be, and the jury's out on that, my own personal feeling is sort of franchise. And again, we can talk about that later if you want to. If they have an aim at all that is strategic and coherent, it's to reimpose a caliphate, a second caliphate. And that caliphate starts in the Middle East. And I presume you all know enough Arabic to know what Al-Qaeda means. In Arabic it means the base, the starting point. And that's what Osama bin Laden was always trying to find. He deliberately wanted, and he said this in a TV interview, he deliberately wanted to provoke the Americans into overreacting. and he wanted to bring them onto his turf. He said that 2 years before 9/11, and that's what he did. The first reaction to 9/11 was so great that if the Americans had been more skillful, and I know I'm coming into your line here, but it might have worked. Think of three things that happened immediately after 9/11. The Russians opened up their two most secret airfields in the east for the Americans to use. Several prominent Palestinians and Middle Eastern, the Israelis would say troublemakers, condemned it, including the senior religious person of one of those movements. Yasser Arafat offered blood, and immediately, bringing in the Northern Ireland dimension, Adams and McGuinness asked to go to America, desperate to explain that they weren't that sort of terrorist at all. But the Americans, who I respect in many ways, cannot fight fog. They got so frustrated at trying to hit will-o'-the-wisp people, and it's a sad fact, as a historian, as a soldier, that go right back to before the Romans. States build up massive great armies that cost the earth, equipped to fight other armies like themselves, but most of the time spend their time running up mountains after badly dressed little people who are much lighter equipped and faster than they are. And that's not trivializing it. That's what armies find themselves doing. And the Americans cannot do it. They're not psychologically capable of doing it. So when they were tired of fighting fog, they looked for a target. And that target to them was old Bush's target, with the plans sitting in the Pentagon, just needing updating. And who were the advisors to Bush? Daddy's advisors. So they went into Iraq. It did achieve in a crazy way that there is a group called the Phoenix Group in America. I don't know if they still exist, but it shows they do read history. And these lunatics, and I met some of them in the Foreign Office when I went to America, believe that if you reduce the whole of the Middle East to chaos and ashes, Phoenix-like out of it would come democracy. It tells you a lot about the complicitness that went on there. But that, of course, did help the general movement of bringing in more terrorist-type activities. I believe the long-term basis for Al-Qaeda, if they are coherent, is to keep the West in a state where it does not integrate its Muslim minorities until the time comes when the first phase is over and they have taken over the Middle East, and then they're ready to come this way. Whether they ever get that far or not is open to debate. But that, I believe, if there is an ideology, and within terms of that, they would have sought to increase terrorism anyway. And I want to sum up by saying that when it comes to Afghanistan, some of you will have heard the term the Great Game. And it was the Great Game. The Russians played it, we played it. But the two most significant players in the Great Game, as far as Afghanistan was concerned, for the West, were two earlier characters, Genghis Khan and Napoleon. The Russians have always been terrified of another horde of Asiatics coming out. And that fear is visceral. When I was with NATO, when the wall came down, I was talking to Russian generals, some of whom had fought in Afghanistan. They were slightly annoyed about losing Eastern Europe, but they were terrifically angry about losing what they thought had been bought with Russian blood over the centuries in the East. We tend to forget that dimension. And we only got really worried about it when Napoleon made a treaty with the Russians to come through and take India. And you don't sit on the chessboard when you're playing chess. And Afghanistan has been an unruly chessboard where the pawns fight themselves. And I've just come back from speaking at an Afghan conference last weekend. And a Scottish friend of mine, a Highlander, said to me, I think there's a lot to say between us Highlanders and the Afghans. And you guess what it is. If we haven't got the English to fight, we'll fight amongst ourselves. There is no blueprint for successful counterinsurgency. And this is where I wind up. But there is a blueprint for failure. The military do not win counterinsurgencies. They are one card in the pack. And every military strategist who's ever written on counterinsurgency will tell you that. And every general, even thick, bull-necked American Marines will tell you that. The military do not win counterinsurgencies. The civil and diplomatic and political side. All the military do is hold the roof up while somebody builds the walls and moves the furniture in. But at the moment, there is nobody building the walls. So it is only the military. And a senior member of my regiment who's just come back from there said the problem is it's rather like putting your hands in a fire bucket full of water. As long as your hands are in there, you're taking up space. As soon as you take your hands out, nobody would ever know you've been there.
Yes.
And that is the frustration for the military, that you are spending the same time after the monsoon season clearing the same area for the civil side to come in and build the schools and assess the political superstructure. But it's not happening. And it's not happening for the simple reason that the other certainty of counterinsurgencies, and I'm sorry if I'm making a point for you, it wasn't my intention, is that whether you look at classic insurgency or whether you look at what I now call interventionist insurgency, which is a new dimension, where a third party comes in and tries to sort it out for you. Unless at some stage you have a stable government in that country which is broadly supported, and it may not be terribly democratic as you and I think of it, but as long as it's broadly supported by the majority of people in that country, there is a chance of getting to the next stage of counterinsurgency, which is moving out of the military phase. But I don't see that in Afghanistan yet. But I'm not there. And when I talk to those who've come back or who are still there, they say that is starting to happen. Counterinsurgencies historically, if you win, take between 10 to 15 years. But you never win them unless the home government is supported by the majority of people in it. And that's the closed question, not the duration. So I'll sum up by saying, if you want to stop now and pull the troops out, that's absolutely fine. But understand that if you do, you're condemning it to go back not to what it's been 10 years ago, but what it was before that. The Taliban will talk to us, of course they will, just as we talk to the IRA. But they are not yet ready, if they ever will be, to talk to us sincerely about taking part in a democratic government. So that is what the sacrifice is worth, if it's worth anything. And 10 years is the start of solving a counterinsurgency. Thank you.